My name is Nick. I am a member of DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, and we are a member of Housing Justice for All, the Upstate Downstate Alliance, which is a statewide coalition of over 70 organizations representing tenants and homeless New Yorkers and public housing residents. So people may have heard about Housing Justice for All either recently or maybe last year. We fought for and won the biggest renter protections in decades, some would say ever, called the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act. And yeah, the laws obviously helped a lot of people out. They certainly helped protect rent stabilized tenants, but they also just expanded tenants' rights for everyone in the state, in all of New York State. And so I'm gonna sort of give a brief overview of the current political climate that we're in, and then I'm gonna go through the rent strike toolkit. So the Right to Counsel Coalition put together a really amazing, they're part of Housing Justice for All. They put together a really incredible rent strike toolkit. And I can share the link for that in the chat, so people can, sort of peruse that and use the resources that it has. And then also we don't have to share slides. You can just use that document after this call. So yeah, so I guess to start, before this global pandemic, we were already operating in a system where housing security didn't really exist, right? And so, it was already so chaotic and bad. There were 92,000 homeless New York. Before this crisis, and obviously that's going to get worse. So, at this point now, we're reaching a humanitarian crisis, just in terms of housing. Not even thinking about this global pandemic that is spreading. So, people may have heard that Cuomo, in this, sort of expanded his executive power, and so now we need the government. Which obviously a lot of people rightly criticized. And so now we're calling on the governor to act with that new executive power that he's given himself to cancel rent. So we have right now in New York State an eviction moratorium. People have probably heard that. Housing courts are not open, or landlords cannot file evictions right now. There are certain emergency instances where housing court is still allowing cases to be heard. So like if you were illegally locked out by your landlord, that can be addressed, but in general, evictions cannot happen right now, which is helpful, but that is not a solution to the problem. That's really just kicking the can down the line, because that doesn't say that rent isn't due. It just says that you can't be evicted right now. But we know that when that eviction moratorium is lifted, there are going to be millions of New Yorkers who are unable to pay rent. So the eviction moratorium in and of itself is not really a solution. And then there also was mortgage relief for some small homeowners, but currently there hasn't really been a substantive solution for tenants. So this crisis, coronavirus, and the prospect of double-digit unemployment. I think in New York State it's something like 20% of people are currently unemployed, and so whether it's planned or not, on May 1st, this Friday, millions of people are not going to be able to pay their rent. The expectation from landlords right now is somewhere between 30 and 40% of rent payments in the next few months are going to go unpaid. And that's even in the absence of, some type of legislative victory, some legislative canceling of the rent. So, the crisis is really painful and chaotic and dramatic. And one way or another, there's going to be unprecedented governmental intervention in the real estate market. So the coalition sort of has the question of what is that real estate market going to look like on the other side of this crisis? Is the government going to pave the way for investors and speculators to buy up distressed assets, and sort of consolidate the market, and sort of further the financialization of housing like we saw after the fiscal crisis of 2008? Or is the government going to ensure a fair outcome, and then, an outcome in which people who speculated on the market get maybe bought out at a fair price, and then the state expands its portfolio of permanently affordable housing. So just to get back to Cuomo and the executive branch of our state government, Cuomo and the entire political establishment work for the real estate industry. That's something that I think Housing Justice for All has done a really good job of informing people about. And when we say Cuomo works for the real estate industry, we don't mean that he works for a specific development company. We mean the fact that our entire political economy, really for the last 40 years, but since its inception, has been structured around the rights of property owners and property ownership. Brings to mind the most politically potent person in the US is the homeowner. And our society is really built for them. And, that has implications. It's obviously they are mostly white. And through this, the government has sort of facilitated, through this prioritization of home ownership and private property ownership, the government has facilitated this transfer of wealth away from renters and tenants and towards the real estate industry. So we know that Black and brown New Yorkers have borne, and Black and brown people globally all over the world have really borne the brunt of this transfer of wealth. So on May 1st, we are leading the fight to sort of withdraw our support from that entire system by refusing to pay rent, and by sort of agitating or causing a crisis within this real estate industry that's going to force our governor to act. So, he can act by creating a predictable sort of cancel the rent framework, using federal stimulus money and maybe some sort of subsidy to bail out individual renters who meet maybe certain characteristics, or he can do a rent cancellation in mass. So activists and organizers are sort of saying that we need to set the parameters for what this inevitable bailout looks like. And we need to ensure, again, that the state and federal money that flows to landlords functions maybe as a buyout to increase government-owned social housing and not as a bailout to just protect speculators' investments in real estate. So it's also really important to ensure that renters don't have to prove their worthiness or do the work of any new policy, really that just rent is canceled across the board for everyone. So I shared a link in the chat. I'm not sure if everyone can see it, but if people want to open that, I also can share my screen. And we can go through the rent strike toolkit that I mentioned. Before I do that, I guess, does anyone have any questions about everything I just said? I know it's kind of a lot. Okay, cool.
Not yet.
Cool. Oh yeah, I think I see a question.
I'm unmuting. Hey, just a quick question. I know this is about housing, but you know, I've been involved in ADA, AAD as well, and you know, something that's also come up is commercial rent, especially since a lot of artists, studios are under that rubric, etc. Is that something that the kit will be applicable towards as well? Because I'm organizing a bunch of people who have studios together in terms of putting that a strike together for that as well. So it's two-pronged. It's residential and commercial.
Yeah, yeah. I think in general, this applies. You know, many, if not most, small business owners are commercial tenants. Maybe not residential tenants, but commercial tenants, and they pay a landlord. So, you know, basically everything I'm talking about here can apply and sort of be extrapolated to them as well. It's a little bit different with commercial tenants because things like tenants unions and organizing as a building maybe isn't possible, but definitely I know that there are coalitions for commercial renters to sort of wield their power as one group, and there are people organizing around that. So
And not to take your time away from the overall picture, but just quickly, why is it harder for a building to organize, a commercial building to organize, as opposed to a residential?
yeah, so I'll get into the sort of strategy that we're advising people to do, but really it starts with um, building and starting, if one already started in your building, a tenants association. You know, and it just having that tenants association sort of builds power, right? There's it's sort of the saying where there's I'm sorry, I'm losing the idiom, but you know, there's power. You have more power as a group than as an individual. So if you're negotiating with your landlord, he will be much more scared to negotiate with you if it's the whole building or 80% of the building than if it's just me saying, "Hey, landlord, I can't pay rent." So that's sort of just there's power in unity and people being collective and making decisions collectively and making demands collectively.
Obviously, but the association is a good way to do that. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, so can everyone see this? I can maybe make it full screen. I don't know if this is gonna work. Can people see just the toolkit on the screen? Is that it?
Yes. Yeah, it's pretty clear.
Okay, great. So I definitely recommend after this call, everyone follows this link I posted in the chat for this toolkit. Again, it was put out by the Right to Counsel Coalition and Housing Justice for All. And it has some really interesting history, facts about rent strikes, FAQs about the eviction moratorium that I was speaking about earlier, and then oh wait, it said, can people still see it? It says sharing is paused. You can still see? Okay, great. And then there's tools and resources for people. So things like sample rent strike demand letter, templates for outreach flyers and petitions and things like that. So really to just start with the demands, there are three main demands from the coalition. The first is a cancellation of rent, mortgage, and utility payments. And we want that cancellation to be automatic and universal for any and all rent, mortgage, and utility payments owed or accumulated during this crisis. So again, we don't want it to be means tested, and we don't want it to be to have to include checking off certain boxes and jumping through hoops, because we know that the people who are most impacted by this crisis may be undocumented or maybe people who don't have the resources or the ability to prove that they have lost income or that they have been impacted by this. The second thing we want is a rent freeze. So a rent freeze is different. So canceling rent, right, means rent is not due and it will not be due in the future ever. A rent freeze means that the amount you pay for rent is frozen at the level that people are currently paying. So we're also calling for all rent to be frozen at its current level, and for all tenants to have the right to renew their leases. I don't want to get too into the weeds now, but if you're not a rent stabilized tenant in New York right now, there are no laws saying that your landlord can't increase your rent as much as he wants. And if you're not a rent stabilized tenant, a landlord also has the right to not renew your lease. He doesn't have to give a reason. He can just say, I don't want you to live here anymore. When your lease is expired, you have to move out. The rent laws that were passed last year that I talked about expanded the time frame that a landlord is required to notify tenants about the desire for him to increase rent by more than 5% or to not renew your lease. So it's increased that time frame, but the law as it exists currently still says that your landlord can increase the rent by as much as he wants and not renew their lease if you're not a rent stabilized tenant. So we're calling for that to not be possible, especially during this time. And then the third pillar, which is really important, is investing $10 billion in homes for everyone. Like I said before, 92,000 people were homeless before this crisis even started. And those people are at very, very high risk of contracting COVID-19. So we have to immediately house these New Yorkers into permanent housing. And we need to use, all vacant property we have. We need to expand rental assistance programs. And just really expand social housing in a way that is really unprecedented. But we think that we know that that's necessary to sort of fix this crisis. Okay, so the toolkit then has a really interesting history of rent strikes. I know
Mike, sorry to interrupt, but we only see one image. At least I only see one image, which is it was the beginning image. I don't know if you've been scrolling through.
Okay.
Okay. Now we see more. Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was in full screen, and sometimes sharing screens gets weird when you're in full screen mode. So I'm just gonna leave it like this. Sorry, it's a little bit messy, but so people can see me advancing the slides. Okay, great. Okay, so those were our 3 demands. And then the toolkit has a really incredible, just quick summary of different rent strikes throughout history. Here, I think it's important just to say that a lot of the protections, if not maybe all of the, maybe not all, but many of the protections as renters we have now are because of rent strikes that happened maybe 100 years ago, if not longer than that. So the first rent strike in New York City was actually organized by immigrant Jewish women on the Lower East Side, and they were facing extreme increases in rent, and they were able to get rent rollbacks, and some even won leases, which I think 100 years ago leases were a little bit, the housing situation was obviously incredibly different. So I definitely recommend people, we don't have time to go through it now, but people flip through the history, because I think it's a really important piece in understanding the role that rent strikes have played in just affording renters more rights and more protections. And rent strikes actually became legal in 1929. So now Section 755 of New York's real property law allows tenants to withhold rent for lack of basic services. Okay, there's obviously like a very robust history throughout the 5 boroughs and throughout the state of organized rent strikes. So this is a sheet that sort of makes the case for going on rent strikes. The first is that rent strikes are really powerful. Like I said before, when a collective group of tenants decides to withhold rent over a sufficient period of time, while also at the same time, making their demands public, through rallies and the press, it sort of upends this power dynamic of the landlord, um, exerting extreme power over people who rent their homes. So rent strikes sort of upend or challenge that power dynamic. And like I said before, like everyone just saw, rent strikes have been used throughout history to win protections for tenants. And also, like I said before, they are currently legal according to Section 755 of the Real Property Action and Proceedings Law. The other thing that we think is really important as a coalition to stress is that they have nothing to do with morality. So a lot of people have they have this feeling, or they feel like they're obligated to pay what they owe. But any feeling you have about a moral obligation to pay your landlord, the landlord oftentimes does not reciprocate that feeling. These questions here I think are really important. Does your landlord treat you with dignity and respect? Do you get the repairs that you need at the quality that you would your landlord would want for yourself? So this whole set of demands, and this whole larger rent strike organizing is really fighting for tenants to live with dignity and respect. And the other thing that is super important, I maybe should have started this presentation with, is that rent strikes are a tactic, right? They are a tactic, not a goal. So you use a rent strike traditionally, when we weren't in the middle of a global pandemic. If you didn't have heat in your building, for instance, and your landlord was saying, you owe me rent, it's the first of the month, tenants could organize collectively using a rent strike as a tactic with the goal of getting heat back in their building. So obviously the situation is different, but
Mike, sorry. For a second you skipped, so we couldn't really hear what you were saying. In case you want to repeat.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, just that rent strikes are a tactic and not a goal. The goal is not for me as a single tenant in my building in apartment number 20 to not pay rent for May. The goal is to have Governor Cuomo cancel rent, mortgage, utility payments for everyone in New York State across the board. So we'll get into the tactic and the goals in a little bit, but yeah, I think that's just really important to stress. It's not the goal is a full cancellation statewide, and we're using and publishing and spreading this rent strike as a tactic to reach that goal. So these rent strikes should be collective, they should be public, and they should be well organized. So getting back to the question of how is it different for commercial tenants? It has the potential to be the same, but any rent strike that exists should have these three things. They should be collective, they should be public, and they should be well organized. So if you are in a building, you want to organize a tenants association with everyone in the building. You don't want to just have this be a situation where one apartment in a big building is sort of making these demands. You want it to be a well thought out, well strategized, organized collective. And I also, I'm not going to get into all of these points because I think a big part of this, which will be helpful for people, is the Q&A. But I really recommend people read through this, 32-page document. I think there's a lot of helpful information in it. And then there's some information on court and legal support. Typically, before all of this happened, the threat of the rent strike often was enough to win demands from landlords. Obviously, like I just said, our demands and our goals are bigger than just what the tenants in one building have with the landlord in their specific building. But all of this stuff is risky and it's tricky, and it may be good to talk to a lawyer because I'm not a lawyer, and I don't want to necessarily give legal advice to people. But there are plenty of housing rights groups and uh, uh, groups, and I'll get into work that DSA is doing that people can join if they have questions at the end of the call. But another thing that's really important to know is that as of last year, that rent law that was passed in June of 2019 eliminated the tenants blacklist. So people should not be worried about going on a landlord or I guess tenants blacklist, because that is no longer legal. Landlords cannot use a tenants blacklist to reject people for housing that they apply for in the future. So like I said, this is obviously a different environment that we're living in. Some ways that a rent strike right now in our rent strike is different than a typical rent strike is that we have the eviction moratorium, right? So currently tenants who are unable to pay rent have a little bit more breathing room because they can't be immediately evicted. But at some point that moratorium will end and that will not be the case. But that's just something to think about. Also, this is a national movement and honestly an international movement, but there is, there are people all over this country that are organizing similarly to what Housing Justice for All and the Right to Counsel Coalition in New York are doing. And again, the goals are just different. So we're trying to put economic pressure on landlords so that tenants can create a crisis for the entire real estate industry and the market and the political influence they have, so that we can win legislative or policy relief for everyone in the state, not just building by building. Yeah, and then the other thing is, this is such a crisis that's going to impact so many people. When housing courts do reopen, we know that there's going to be, unless there's specific and widespread policy relief, there will be a surge in evictions. So, we're currently in the process of sort of building power, the power that we need to win our demands. So people may have heard, but this is likely the biggest rent strike in our state's history in the past 100 years. So it's historic. It's really nothing that anyone in our lifetimes has really seen or dealt with. So again, there are risks. This is a strike. There are risks. The possibility exists that a landlord faced with sustained non-payment of rent from tenants will sue tenants in court. Everyone deciding to go on rent strike should know that it's possible. In a normal rent strike, tenants are protected, maybe by saving or putting their money in escrow or something like that. And the situation right now is that people just don't, people are striking or people are not paying rent because they don't have the money. People aren't able to save their money to demand things. It's just, oftentimes millions of people don't have the money, basically, is what I'm saying. Another sort of reason to be hopeful is that we're getting a lot of press and media attention on this. And, the headlines are really powerful. And I think, this crisis, specifically with rent, specifically in New York, New York City, where the majority of people are renters, the media and the headlines around this, I think, are really hitting close to home and really impacting people.